Coming up now, we have the panel on the press perspective for industrial control systems. That'll be moderated by Blake Sobczak, and also on the panel will be Kim Zetter, Sean Lingus, and August Cole. One of the reasons that I came up with this panel the other year is that I think part of the issue around industrial control systems is that we need transparency and understanding. I mean, there is a whole question of what is the government doing, what is industry doing, what does the public understand about that, and that we owe them that. So it looks like Kim and Sean are still in the waiting room. Oh, all right, we got Sean. I'm going to send Kim a webcam request. The panel floor is yours.
Well, hi everyone, and thanks Bryson. Thanks for having the panel, and thanks to Sean and August and Kim, who will be joining momentarily for being here. I just wanted to do some quick introductions. I'm Blake Sobczak. I'm deputy editor of E&E News's Energy Wire. We focus on the energy industry from the oil and gas sector to the utility sphere, and I also write the weekly cybersecurity update for E&E News' site. To just briefly introduce our panel, Sean Lingus is joining us from CyberScoop. He's a senior reporter there where he covers hacking threats to critical infrastructure, including industrial control systems, which I know is a big focus of today's events, as well as medical devices and election systems. Before joining CyberScoop, Sean was a freelance journalist in West Africa, where he reported on everything from a presidential election in Ghana to military mutinies in Ivory Coast for the New York Times. So Sean's reporting has also appeared in the Washington Post, The Economist, and the BBC, among other outlets. And in 2017, he received a grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting to investigate cybersecurity challenges in the nuclear sector. So welcome, Sean. And Kim Zetter, many of you are familiar with. She's an award-winning investigative journalist who has covered cybersecurity and national security for more than a decade, perhaps most notably as a staff writer for Wired, where she wrote for 13 years. And more recently as a freelancer for the New York Times Magazine, Politico, the Washington Post, Motherboard, and Yahoo News. She has been voted one of the top 10 security journalists in the country by security professionals and her journalism peers. She has broken numerous stories about NSA and FBI surveillance, nation-state hacking, and election security, and is also considered an expert on cyber warfare. And she authored the great book, Countdown to Zero Day, Stuxnet and the Launch of the World's First Digital Weapon. So welcome, Kim, and thanks for being on the panel.
Thank you.
And finally, August Cole. He is an author exploring the future of conflict through fiction and other forms of fiction and intelligence storytelling, or FICINT. Do I have that right? With Peter Singer, he co-authored Ghost Fleet, a novel on the next World War, and Burn In, more recently, a novel of the real robot revolution. He is a non-resident fellow at the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity at Marine Corps University. And he now consults on creative features at Spark Cognition, an artificial intelligence company. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brent Snowcroft Center on Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council, and directed the Council's Art of Future Warfare project from its inception in 2014 through 2017. And certainly relevant for this panel, he's a former defense industry reporter for the Wall Street Journal. So welcome, August. So thank you all so much for being here. To get things started, I just kind of wanted to ask a simple question, but one that carries a lot with it in today's pandemic era, which is, how are each of you doing? August, I don't know if you want to jump in first.
Sure, I'll lead off with a, this is back to school week. So we are, living in the future right now where, something as fundamental as the fall's return to classrooms has been virtualized, in my case, living in the Boston area. And in many ways, COVID has offered this preview of what's ahead in the next decade with software-driven and robotic automation. And so a lot of my days are I'm kind of caught between like two decades, trying to make sense of it all. And of course, the political climate too, I think portends a lot of friction and instability in the next decade as well. So, I have my moments when I'm a bit overwhelmed by the future, to be honest, having it pulled forward to 2020, but we're hanging in there.
John, how about yourself?
I'm doing pretty well, thanks, Blake, and thanks for hosting the panel. Obviously, reporting life has changed dramatically. Been working from home for the last 6 months, Haven't actually done any in-person source meetings for 6 months, which feels very strange and takes away a big personal aspect of reporting, as I'm sure you can appreciate. So had to adjust to that. On the phone more, everything virtual, connecting with people more, taking even more care, I would like to think, to secure communications with people because everything's virtual. And also, of course, developing a new appreciation for the health beat, reporters who are covering the race for a vaccine and the overwhelming of hospitals and things that are much more here and now than sometimes the bits and bytes that I cover are.
And Kim, how have you been adjusting?
I guess pretty much like everyone else. I mean, it hasn't been a huge adjustment for me from working from home because I've been working from home as a freelancer for about 3 years now. So that hasn't been a big change, but obviously, like what Sean said about meeting sources in person, all the conferences now, which is a big part of meeting with sources in person doesn't happen because everything is virtual now. And everything, of course, is really slowed down, just getting responses to emails, setting things up. But there's also sort of the counter of that is that because everyone is home and everyone is sort of on all the time, even if they don't want to be, there's a lot more nighttime and weekend communication coming in during off hours that makes you feel like it never really ends. But yeah, I mean, just in general, it feels like, especially because I cover the election stuff so much, this feels like, there's a vice on us all that just gets squeezed tighter and tighter because we're not dealing with just the pandemic and the issues of working from home, but here in California also with the fires. For a long time, we felt like we were doing pretty well with the pandemic because we closed down pretty much before the rest of the country did in my county. But we still had the ability to go out and have fresh air and exercise and things. But when the fires hit, I think that was really rough for people in California and Oregon and Washington. But other than that, I mean, it's, there's just obviously the news doesn't slow down. There was a brief period, I think, of a couple of months where the news was all pandemic. You couldn't get an editor interested in anything except that. But now it's all starting to come back now.
I certainly remember that period well, and obviously there's been a lot of bad news to cover, and definitely thinking of the West these days with all the challenges surrounding wildfires and climate change. And I know a common critique of cybersecurity reporting is that it does tend to focus on that negative news in the news cycle, with all the breaches, the epic fails, the face plants by chief information security officers, so forth. I guess I'm wondering what you would say to that and sort of what factors into each of your own news judgment, or in August's case, narrative judgment. Sean, I don't know if you want to start there.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's plenty of negative news to report, and it's part of the means of holding people accountable when things go wrong, but it's also about not bashing people over the head if they don't deserve to be bashed over the head. I mean, breaches are going to happen, so you cover the company's response or the organization's response and how transparent they are about it, and not to make it look as if they are the only organization suffering from that kind of thing. But we try to cover positive things sometimes. It's really a judgment in terms of I mean, it's very vague, but what is news? I mean, what is if someone is working to protect a vaccine from being compromised via hacking or something else, that's obviously positive news. You tell that story. You don't tell it just because it's positive news. You tell it because it's important news. And the same thing for someone who's trying to do something negative. So, not out to tell negative stories, but sometimes it skews that way. And I think at least our publication, we have a lot of latitude to cover a lot of different things, and, within cybersecurity. So we're a little bit lucky in that regard. I think sometimes the big papers, sometimes it might be hard to get an editor interested in a niche, like a positive story about someone building better network defense, something like that. But as a trade publication, we can do that. So I don't know. I think there's a bit of a misconception out there about that we're out for negative press. You do want to drop the hammer when it's deserved and hold people accountable, but it's all about context. I mean, one quick example: the other day, a security researcher reached out to me regarding what he thought was a sort of a data breach, an exposure of PII, and at first blush, it looked pretty egregious is too strong of a word, but it wasn't. You know, there was a lot of data out there that maybe that this company looked like it was exposing, and then the process of reporting it out, it turns out a lot of that data is public, and for now, the story's on hold because, you know, first of all, this isn't the only company that's doing this. Second of all, you know, the data is available in other forms, and so maybe there's a broader story about why this data shouldn't be public. But the story isn't, company X is, you know, is just has your PII just sitting out there and is just utterly negligent because their compliance with state laws. So that kind of context where you're not bashing someone who doesn't need to be bashed is, I think, important.
August or Kim, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I'll talk about it from a non-journalistic perspective. When it comes to working on big projects like Ghost Fleet or Burn-In most recently, getting ahead of the kinds of problems that we described in these fictional worlds was very much part of our motivation. I think to some extent this reflects my own interests in becoming a journalist and the work that I did in that phase of my career, because I do feel like there is a really important accountability aspect to beat coverage and enterprise reporting, but also the explanatory aspect too. And I think particularly when it comes to cyber vulnerabilities, and I say all this very humbly as a layperson, being able to communicate the why is really, really hard to do often. But I think when you get to narrative, you can start to do so. A good example would be, if a fighter plane has a supply chain hardware vulnerability, what does that mean, for example, when that aircraft is deployed in wartime? Is it actually going to be shot down for that reason? That's a scenario from Ghost Fleet. Or in Burn-In, when you look at the way that old infrastructure has been updated and connected to the internet, perhaps when it shouldn't be, because it can't be actually secured in a really responsible way, but the kind of onward march of technology and convenience and efficiency requires it in effect, then you're creating systemic vulnerabilities in society that we may not be aware of, or that not enough people may be aware of. And so, yeah, I think you can often talk about bad stuff or bad news in a way that is a little bit different than when it's splashed on a front page, which of course is incredibly important and powerful and often drives the kinds of insights in the narrative realm. But at the same time, being able to push those kinds of ideas out there. I've seen it happen where people can be in a meeting or have official conversations and essentially push bad news upwards, which isn't often what happens because it's been posited in the fictional realm, and that allows someone to take action, say again on supply chain security or cyber vulnerability in a weapon system, et cetera. So part of that is I think a really critical motivation to the novels that I've worked on with Peter Singer, but even in the short fiction I do too. I mean, failure of imagination, like in the decade that we're in, is inexcusable because so much is possible, both for good and for bad.
Kim, I wanted to latch on to some of your comments earlier on that section of the pandemic when editors just weren't interested in any sort of cybersecurity news. And obviously, there's never been a directly fatal cyber attack to anyone's public knowledge. And in the middle of this horrific pandemic, which has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives in the US alone, it can feel a bit strange to specialize or train a spotlight on an issue like cybersecurity. I guess, what's changed, if anything, about the way you approach the topic since the pandemic began, or some of the challenges you've faced in working as a freelancer?
Nothing really changed in my approach. I stopped pitching essentially for a while. I knew that editors just weren't interested in it, and they were overwhelmed themselves personally with everything that they were dealing with their staffs and getting set up remotely and all that. So there was a good several months where I just wasn't pitching, and that was fine with me because I was, adjusting myself. Now, of course, with the election in full steam, there's a lot of interest again on the election stuff. And of course, DHS is, in the last couple of months have come out with some, high-profile announcements and press releases and things like that. So it's all picking up again. It's all starting to come back. And of course, the InfoSec community has reminded us from the beginning, the hackers don't stop in a pandemic. They might, as Sean was pointing out, they might switch their focus to things like the security of vaccine data and stats and things like that. So the focus might be the subject matter of what they're going after might differ a little, but they're still doing their attacks. So that hasn't changed at all. But I wanted to just sort of address for a second about what you talked about, that a lot of this often seems like negative news and alarmist news. And I mean, when you've covered this a while, you feel like you're reporting the same story over and over again, especially if you're talking about breaches or phishing attacks and things like that. And so it is the same thing over and over again. And you run the risk of fatigue for the reporter, obviously, but most importantly, fatigue for editors and fatigue for the public. And the danger then is that everyone feels like they have to sort of amp it up to get notice, and particularly companies that are doing security research, they feel like they have to stand out in some way, so everything becomes a very sophisticated attack, everything becomes very alarmist. And so it's our job as gatekeepers to sort of put the brakes on that and say, no, this isn't new, this isn't sophisticated, this isn't advanced. And then also to explain to editors, because quite often the beat reporter knows the topic better than the editor does. And so the editors are sometimes chasing the headlines. They see what other publications are publishing, and then they come to you as the reporter and say, why don't we have that, or why aren't we doing that? And that happens a lot with InfoSec reporters. We sort of grouse about, one story breaks and then, 20 editors are wanting the same story from all of their reporters. And that's real unfortunate because, with so many InfoSec reporters now, I mean, it is really a wealth of riches to have so many people covering this topic now because it is so vast. There are so many things that need to be highlighted and touched on and dug into deeply. And so when people are chasing the same story over and over again, it really is a disservice to readers to get 20 stories on the same thing. So, so the task for journalists, who are on this beat for a long time, is trying to walk that balance, that line between what is really significant, what's important, using that context, and what you talked about, the why, explaining the why to readers and to editors. You have to explain to your editor, look, I know this doesn't seem like an important story to you, but let me sit down with you and tell you why it is, and why this hasn't happened before, something like that. And your sources will help you with that as well if you're not sure. So.
Can any of you shed a little light? One of the goals that I have with this panel is really to shed some behind the scenes insight and light on some of how the journalistic sausage gets made, if you will, and what goes into some stories. So can any of you speak to how you go about confirming, say, a seemingly exaggerated but maybe legit cybersecurity report or a rumor of a major breach or cybersecurity incident? How do you go about that verification process, just as a basic, repertorial strategy? And Sean, I don't know if you want to start out there.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sure. Sorry. Yeah, while we're talking, of course, there's breaking news.
It's been a busy news day for cybersecurity, which is
the Department of Justice just indicted some more Iranian alleged Iranian hackers. Wow. How do I go about confirming? Well, it all depends on the story, I guess. I mean, it's good to have that one-on-one relationship with both independent subject matter experts who are not involved in what's going on, but also people who work, within government on the particular subject. So I don't know. I mean, the byword is caution. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of examples I could give, I guess. I mean, we're also like I said, we're a small publication, so we kind of churn out a lot of news. But of course, that doesn't mean we sacrifice integrity. So while not every story might not be like a huge story, it has to be solid. I guess the other day, a good example was I'm sure Kim followed, was the report in a Russian news outlet about alleged voter registration database compromises in 2020. And it turned out, I mean, according to all available information, that was old data that was already, most of it already public, and it was sort of been repackaged. And just because it was a Russian news outlet didn't actually debunk it, because it was one of the few, I think, semi-independent, and it wasn't RT or Sputnik, let's put it that way. But you know, the easy thing with that is, you know, it's going viral on Twitter. But even before we tweet about something, we want to, you know, a tweet is not necessarily endorsement, but it is propagating it. And if it's not a truthful story, obviously you don't want to do that. So with that kind of thing, when you're immersed in the beat, like Kim is with election security and other topics, and I try to be with election security, with ICS, you're able to be on a texting basis with people and just be able to sort of vet things quickly. Like, do I even speak publicly? Do I even, you know, say anything? Do I even say, oh, well, this is an interesting report on Twitter? Or do I mean, you wait first, and something, especially in an election year when we're this close to the election, like I am really hesitant to even, you know, give any sort of airtime to anything that's not 100%. Like, I mean, obviously in a story, but even on Twitter. So I mean, being more careful on Twitter even. Yeah, the vetting process just varies. I mean, we get a lot of research reports from companies in the industry. A lot of them are solid, and many of them are not. And the ones that aren't solid are often up-and-coming companies that are trying to make a name for themselves by getting ink in publications big and small. And there's often this tight turnaround with embargoes. So how do you vet that stuff? You have a bunch of security researchers on Signal, and you know, coordinate with them and say, well, you track this group, does this look like what you've seen? They might say, no, that looks like FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. They might say, well, I haven't seen that particular set of activity. However, the analysis looks pretty solid. So it's just a process. And with more established companies, obviously you're not going to just take it verbatim, but there's less of a, I mean, you know, when Microsoft puts out a blog on TTPs of various threat actors,
Tactics, yeah,
tactics and techniques. Yeah. I mean, when Microsoft has great telemetry, and you know, I mean, it can also serve as marketing for them, of course, but it's a little easier to report on that quickly rather than some random company claiming to have spotted the next fancy bear attack. So.
No, I totally agree with, and as an editor, obviously, you know, I really respect that more conservative approach to making sure something's obviously very, very, you know, I's are dotted, T's are crossed before going to print with it or even tweeting about it. That carries a lot of risks. But I do wonder if there's somewhat of a maybe conceptual risk that's attached to that approach that August hinted at earlier, which is this, you know, notion of a failure of imagination, perhaps, in some cybersecurity journalism, and a reticence to tug some angles of, you know, what might happen in the future or what may not yet be, you know, propagating in the wild, so to speak, among actual, you know, computer systems and networks, but that could theoretically be a huge issue. August, I don't know if you can speak to that, and I just wonder what your thoughts are on imagination in journalism when everybody's obviously going to take such a careful approach to vetting their information.
It's a really interesting paradox, because journalism is an inherently creative profession, and what I found personally challenging was wanting to write about what was going to happen, but really needing to write about what just happened, and not always being successful at convincing my editors that, you know, it was worth the investment of time and resources to, you know, unpack an issue like private military contractors, for example, you know, before that issue became really a front page one. And so, you know, in part, leaving journalism, in fact, was driven by this frustration. And now in the fictional realm, you know, I've been able much more to apply the very same reporting, you know, and analytical processes to creating fiction, you know, that Pete and I are calling useful fiction, right? Like, it's really rooted in real world technology, real world dynamics, so that it has a veracity to it that, you know, something that is more fantastical in the science fiction realm, for example, might not. And, you know, and that, you know, still, I think, requires, though, source relationships and development, and also, you know, some reciprocity that's, of course, different than when you're, you know, a high church kind of practicing journalist. And one of the really interesting experiences I found when I lived in DC then, when I quit, was, you know, talking to sources and really wondering if they would ever talk to me again once I no longer had business card from from a major newspaper. And in fact, it was actually far easier to talk to people, it turned out, once I didn't have that card. And that was a nice lesson in DC, because there's of course a lot of hard ones that we learn when we work there, that that you can continue those relationships and sometimes even deepen them, even though you've left a certain publication or platform or job. And I think that aspect to anybody's career, I think, is really critical to think about, especially because journalism is a field where people make big shifts and changes, right? I mean, a lot of the colleagues I collaborated with on cyber stories, which was somewhat unusual, I think, within the journal at the time to be that collaborative, but that's just kind of how I am. But working with Siobhan Gorman and Yoki Drazen at the time on big hacking stories, that ensured we didn't get spun, right? Because we had different pools of sources and we're working different angles and different just ways of looking at issues. And I think collaboration, which is sometimes hard to do in the field, is probably one of the best ways to ensure that you're actually getting as close to what truth you can discover.
And I think when we talk about imagination in journalism, I can hear a lot of beat reporters, for instance, in 2016, in the run-up to some of the cybersecurity problems that plagued that election cycle, actually already focusing on some of these issues and thinking about what's going wrong and sort of sounding some of the alarm bells, but maybe that didn't always make it to page one above the fold, so to speak. And Kim, as somebody who's covered the election space in particular for a long time, I guess, what do you think of that challenge of navigating what could happen with something as sensitive as election infrastructure?
Yeah, it's been tough, particularly this new cycle, because of the charges that if you are talking about potential vulnerabilities or potential attacks, you're aiding the Russians, right? And you're aiding, let's say, Trump, who is sort of trying to sow mistrust in the election outcome even before the election occurs. So that's been really tough. There have been stories that I've shelved that I would have done in another election year, that I'm not doing this time around, because there is that concern of trying to balance those two, between trying to inform people so that no one is taken by surprise about certain things, but also being cognizant of the timing for certain stories. And so that's been an issue. Obviously, everything is really charged right now around the election, and there's just a lot of misinformation flying. So I think the better service, rather than sort of spinning out all of the scenarios that could happen, is addressing the misinformation and correcting that and informing people. For instance, a lot of reporters have done some great work on the vote by mail stuff, and balancing the disinformation about that. And also preparing the public for getting used to not having instant results on election day. So that's been important in that sense. If you don't mind, I'd like to go back to something that Sean and August started to address about confirming. Sorry to take us back there, but I thought it would be good to provide a couple of examples of stories that didn't get confirmed. And one of them, I think it was involving, actually, Blake, you did a great job in finally getting the accurate information out there, but it was a source was contacting a number of reporters about the hack of in Saudi Arabia that was using the Triton. At that time, we didn't understand fully what the attack was involved in. But the information that reporters were getting was that this was Saudi Aramco was the victim. And like Sean was saying, it was very easy for those of us who are in InfoSec to just contact our sources who know that area and say, and indeed some people who actually worked on the investigation, and say, we're learning that this is Saudi Aramco, is this correct? And they were very good about steering us away from that. But there was a reporter who's not an InfoSec reporter, who's more of a geopolitical reporter, who got the same information and didn't reach out to anyone to verify or to sort of do that weighing. And so a story got published that it was Saudi Aramco, and that started spreading very quickly on Twitter. And so those of us who had sources tried to, put the kibosh on that. But it's hard when you have sources who won't go on the record with you. They'll tell you off the record, no, this isn't correct, don't publish something, but they won't tell you what the accurate information is. So you can't, it's hard to counter false information, of course, it's traveling faster than you can come out with accurate information. So your story, Blake, where you actually published that it was this petrochemical plant, not Saudi Aramco, sort of set that record straight, but it took a long time to get that because sources aren't willing to go on the record because they have NDAs with customers and things like that. So doing that kind of confirmation is difficult, especially when not every reporter is doing the confirmation, and some will run with the story, and then you're sitting there thinking, you want to say wait, but you can't really counter it with the real information.
Yeah.
So that was
and
yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Who's
No,
going?
I was just going to hop on there and say that thanks for pointing out my story on that subject, and that is especially challenging, I think, putting that to bed, because there was some elements almost of partial truth to the Saudi Aramco connection, because it was a Saudi Aramco incident response team that arrived on site. Saudi Aramco does have a significant ownership stake in the company that was victimized by this first of a kind attack. So I think that in some ways makes it more challenging, because it's not just a flat out, it's kind of a nuanced denial. It's still not accurate, but it makes it more challenging. But Sean, you were going to say something there?
I just wanted to go back quickly to two things that Kim said that I agree with. I wanted to just chime in on this particular charged environment, tense environment with the election, not doing stories that maybe you would normally do just because you don't want to. I mean, we already it's a tinderbox. You don't want to upset your responsibilities to your readers. And one example, easy example I can give is we cover a lot of election security, or we get, there's a lot of these election security exercises that some private companies host that are, they're good at exercises in imagination. And of course, you want the people running elections and law enforcement and security officials to be doing that kind of stuff. But some of the scenarios are so outlandish that, writing about them in a gripping lead about explosions and chaos at the ballot box. I chose not to write about a recent election or an election security tabletop, just because I just don't want to scare the crap out of people this close to the election. So that's one example. And then also the vote by mail. We are obviously a cybersecurity publication only, and there's no, voting by mail is an InfoSec story, of course, because there's security aspects to it, and depending on how the ballots are sent out, and of course Kim knows the most about this, but it's not a traditional InfoSec story. But given all the disinformation coming, particularly from the White House, we decided to join the party and write our own explainer about how you can vote and why the very, very exceedingly rare cases of voter fraud and the logistics around voting and the Postal Service. So that we felt it was our duty to do that, even though it's very much not a typical story for us.
I did want to go ahead.
Sorry. There was one other example that I wanted to give about the confirmation stuff, which was, is that okay if I?
Yeah, absolutely.
I like this one because it happened before there was a lot of InfoSec reporting, before there were a lot of InfoSec journalists. This happened in 2011. And it was also kind of in a charged environment because it was post Stuxnet discovery, which was in 2010. So there was this expectation that there would be a lot of retaliation from Iran and other targets, that suddenly there was this this target on the back of critical infrastructure that hadn't existed before. And now that ICS, industrial control systems, were known to be vulnerable, there would be a lot of attacks by nation states. And so what happened in this case was in 2011, a fusion center report came out that a utility in Illinois, in Springfield, Illinois, had been hacked by the Russians, and that they had destroyed a water pump by turning it on and turning it off and wearing out the motor. And so the fusion report wasn't distributed publicly. It was meant to only go within government circles, but someone obtained it because these things are often widely distributed to police departments and others who don't necessarily, secure their websites, as we discovered with WikiLeaks. And so these reports got in the hands of someone who provided it to journalists. And journalists published it as a straight story that the Russians had hacked this water pump. But there was something that didn't pass the smell test because the details were a little fuzzy, and there was information. I think there was a Washington Post reporter that mentioned a contractor and a Russian hacker. So I was intrigued by this mention of the contractor because I thought maybe there's something getting lost in the translation here, and if I go to the technical guy who knows more, then I can get more information about this. But I didn't know who the contractor was. But I discovered that the county, I forget what county Springfield, Illinois is in, was going to be having like a board meeting, and on the agenda was posted online. One of the items on the agenda was that they were going to be discussing this Russian hack of the water pump. And so this was Illinois. I'm based in San Francisco. At the time, I was working for Wired, but it was Wired News at the time. It was a very small outlet, and we didn't have a lot of money, and no one was going to send me. So I decided to see if I could find a local journalism student who might be able to go to this board meeting and take a recorder with them and ask some questions that I had. So it was during the school break between semesters. It was around the holiday time. But I went online and I found a student newspaper in McGill University, and I contacted 3 or 4 of the reporters there and editors. Only 1 or 2 of them responded. And one of the guys agreed that he would drive, it was like an hour away, that he would go to this meeting and take a recorder, and we would pay him, I think we paid him $150. And I wanted him to record it because I knew that he didn't know the topic, so he might miss nuances or details that I might be able to pick up if it was recorded. So he did record it. There's nothing interesting in the actual meeting, but afterwards, one of the people from the utility, he sidelined them and he had the recorder on and he asked them a question, and they mentioned this contractor again. And they mentioned where the contractor, I don't remember, they didn't mention the contractor by name, but they mentioned something that made it clear that I could probably find who this contractor was. So I was able to find the contractor. I did some searching and I found some notices that this guy had set up this system for them. And when I contacted him, it was funny because there are all these stories that are already published about this water pump hack. And I contacted him, and his first words of his mouth were, "It's about time. Why hasn't anyone contacted me before now?"
Great words to hear from a source.
Yes, but it wasn't just the reporters who hadn't contacted him. The Fusion Center that wrote the report had never contacted him. So the story in the end was that it was identified as a hack by a Russian because it was coming from a Russian IP address. So the story is that 6 months before the water pump broke down, there had been, when the water pump broke down, they brought in a contractor, an IT guy. He's looking at the logs, the access logs. He sees 6 months prior, there's an IP address from Russia. And he connects those dots and thinks that in June, there was an IP address from Russia, and 6 months later, the water pump breaks, and that's how it gets connected. So it gets connected into this Fusion Center report, and of course it's a game of telephone, and it just builds and builds on itself. It turns out the IP address was this contractor. He was on vacation in Russia, his wife is Russian, and something had happened at the water treatment plant in June, 6 months before the pump broke, and they'd asked him to remote in and look at some data and see if he could find anything. He didn't bother to tell them he was in Russia while he was doing it. He didn't mess with the water pump, but that's sort of the thing about how these stories can sort of take off, and especially if you're dealing with people who don't understand the technology or don't know the questions to ask, it's just taken on face value.
No, that's a great anecdote, and no, that is a great example of how these things can take off. And I think they take off because they prey on some very valid potential technical fears and issues of unupdated critical infrastructure networks, of disasters waiting to happen, lurking in some of these sensitive industrial control systems. And August, I know in your most recent book, Burn-In, you feature some pretty shocking catastrophes linked to cybersecurity adjacent related issues, including artificial intelligence and robotics. I'm wondering if you can speak at all to maybe some fun you've had assembling some of those plausible scenarios. And before you do answer that, I just want to point out to the audience that feel free to submit any questions you have for any of us here. I'll see those popping up in my chat window here, and can get to a few of them toward the end of the session. So I just wanted to put in that plug if you want to start thinking about if you have any questions for Sean, August, Kim, or myself. So anyway, yeah, August, I don't know if you want to describe a little bit of the reporting as well that goes into the fiction stories that you write.
Sure, and that reporting, often begins with the kernel of an idea, and therefore finding out how to render something that could be fantastical, like hacking a flying car. What are the levels of feasibility? Because though we're in this case with burn-in writing, essentially 2 decades almost into the future, very sensitive to sort of what Sean was talking about, and encountering, for example, a war game that is so outrageous or fantastical that it doesn't actually kind of pass the giggle test, as one person said when I had written a short story for a Defense Department project, and I was dealing with kind of a hacking concept, and that was essentially the same sort of thing where I'm a layperson, so I have to make sure that what I'm proposing or talking about it has enough tether in reality so that it kind of fits within the framework of having a useful story. And so with burn-in, we're dealing with this future environment with a very radicalized political domestic situation in the US. There's automation and robotics, job replacement trends that are accelerating. And within that, is this sense of like techlash, right, that we kind of see in one way today, being made manifest. And so, therefore, you kind of put your adversary hat on. And I suppose it's sort of like red teaming to some extent, but when also you're collaborating with a co-writer, you can kind of spool each other up and take ideas even farther and farther down that path. And yet so to create something fantastical is important, but again, anchoring it in reality is critical. And then also thinking about the kind of then what, or like what's the ask of a reader, right? And I think about this often in the short stories I do as well, which is to say that I can unpack why something could be a really bad situation because of a technical vulnerability, and yet then what, right? Like, is there a way to kind of galvanize people to take action or to consider a strategic vulnerability, from over reliance on technology like Ghost Fleet, for example, and yet doing that in very discrete, kind of almost like case-like ways. But you can't forget, though, even through any of these really quite complicated scenarios that we might unspool, like flooding DC, by hacking upriver ICS systems, is that you really want to tell those stories from a character-driven perspective, and never losing sight of, especially in a novel or a short story, what it's like to be in that situation when waters are rising, or your flying car is crashing, or your robot is no longer responding. And I think that's often lost in very technical fiction, thrillers, even science fiction too. And it's like a cardinal sin to me, because then you're missing the chance to really connect with the reader and get them to engage with that kind of an issue. So as much as we have still yet a long list of things that we can envision adversaries or bad actors doing, we end up bounding ourselves, or binding ourselves a little bit within the kind of realm of reality, in part because I think like stretching the elastic of credulity with the reader is really critical to do it in just the right parts. To refer back to Ghost Fleet, right? And not to spoil too much, but it opens with the Chinese seizing Hawaii, the PLA, Army and Navy, and that is a very outrageous, kind of fantastical idea. And so within that, if you're going to propose something that wild and outlandish, you better have your facts right? You better have the trend lines and also the technical aspects when you're writing for military readers, particularly who have firsthand knowledge of these sorts of trends, dynamic systems, is also really critical. And so there's no kind of issuing a correction per se in the same way with a quick hit news story, when you're doing something much larger like a novel that's predicated perhaps on really key technological or other kind of assumptions. So we stretch that elastic very carefully.
Well, and I think your comment there to the importance of focusing on the narrative and the storytelling aspect of these, even as you can sort of have fun with some of the technical, creative elements, is really important. And it's also important for nonfiction journalists to keep in mind. And Sean, to some of your comments on covering exercises earlier, there's a temptation there with exercises presenting a very nice, convenient sort of narrative that you can seize onto as a day-to-day quick hit journalist. But then you do have to ask yourself, is it responsible to do this? Is this really does this really merit this kind of treatment? Now, Sean and I traveled to a remote government-controlled island, Plum Island, a couple of years ago for a kind of a fun cybersecurity exercise. Sean, I don't know if you want to shed a little light on what happened there and what you'd say to exercise planners who might want to engage more with journalists.
Yeah, well, it was a cold and stormy night on the tip of Long Island. It's a made for TV. I mean, if you can't write a good lead from that exercise, then you should do something else, because there's a Silence of the Lambs angle there too. I think Silence of the Lambs was referenced Plum Island, and it used to be basically a government laboratory for bioweapons, or I can't remember, but anyway, that exercise was great because we're able to be there on the ground in Plum Island while they're this DARPA run exercise where real utility operators from big utilities on the East Coast were charged with doing like a gradual return and restoring power after a theoretical cyber attack. And of course, it's not easy to tie that back into the real world with what's going on in Ukraine. Or what has happened in Ukraine, with two power outages caused by alleged Russian hackers. And those kinds of examples, people in the industry may get tired of hearing journalists use the Ukraine examples as a cautionary note, but we really have to ground the story in that kind of thing. So I think I read all of our articles. There's about 7 journalists on that trip, including Blake and myself, and I read all the articles, and we all started with a different lead anecdote because there were many to choose from, but we all, I think, tied in the Ukraine element because of that. I mean, that's what they're drilling for. That's what the whole project, this expensive exercise, government-run exercise on this obscure or remote island, was partly inspired by the Ukraine attacks. So that's, as long as you have a kind of real-world anchor, and then you explain the difference between what the exercise is doing and what happened in the real world, and also how it's sort of an imagination, it's an exercise in imagination. I think you're okay, and it's worth telling, and it's also indicative. Like, it's the kind of thing where you can get people's reaction to how they're experiencing the exercise, and some people might have, I think the best kinds of exercises are you can kind of cater them to different technical levels of people actually participating. Like, you have the engineers who really know how power is routed and everything, and then you have more coders and people who are more on the software side. So that exercise had a bit of everything, and I think more those kinds of things help us tell the story that needs to be told.
So it looks like we do have a question coming in from the audience. Jason Allnut, who this is actually one of my perennial favorite questions, which is just, I'm curious what the presenters are reading, on topic or off. So August, I don't know if you want to start with that one.
Sure. I'm reading Putin's People right now, which is a new book on the rise. I'm just can't get enough of reading about Putin. So that's my latest. I'm reading John Williams's Butcher Crossing, which is a Western as well, to kind of get some literary inspiration for a current fiction project I'm working on.
Kim, what are you reading these days?
Well, I'm reading what just dropped, which was the Rage book from Woodward. So sifting through that at the moment.
And I just finished my favorite travel writer, Paul Theroux. One of his, I think it's like the 8th of his that I've read, his journey through China in the late 80s or the mid 80s. And now I'm on to a novel called The Orphan Master's Son that won the Pulitzer a few years ago, about a North Korean orphan.
Great, those all sound really interesting. I just finished up Kafka on the Shore, actually, and we'll be going on. I have a little book club going during the pandemic that we've been going through a couple different fiction and nonfiction novels. And I think next up we're going to go with a French spy thriller of some Le Carré persuasion. So we'll see how that goes. So it looks like we do have another question coming up from Kaylin Tricon, who says, Sean mentioned this briefly in the beginning about data breaches being a constant, and how they are reported depends largely on how the organization handles the disclosure. So I guess this is more of 2 questions. One, are companies being more transparent when it comes to disclosing data breaches, or do you still see organizations trying to bury incidents? And then as a follow-up to that, what advice do you have for communications teams when it comes to engaging press around data breach disclosure? So 2 questions there. And Kim, I don't know if you want to start out with that one as far as whether companies are being more transparent with any of this.
Well, it really depends. It varies. I mean, there are companies that do sort of take the bull by the horn and come out with a proactive announcement. And even if they don't have all the information to begin with, like Twitter did, you know, with the Twitter hack, they were very proactive about keeping people informed and in a really informal way by tweeting out a message, and then a more formal way when they had more information. I think that that's what people want. You know, everyone is going to get hacked. There's no shame anymore in being a victim, or there shouldn't be, unless, you know, obviously there are circumstances around that you've ignored. But in terms of transparency, I think that's always the best that you can do. Obviously, there are difficulties that a public company has to weigh in terms of notification to board members first and other things like that. But I think that compared to how it used to be, where no one gave you any information about anything, all you got was a notice in the mail saying that you know, your data had been stolen. That was it, and nothing else ever. It's obviously a lot better now. So,
Sean, did you have anything to add to that?
Oh yeah, well, I'm actually glad Kim went first because it's softened my my immediate reflex answer was no, it hasn't gotten better. But if you take a longer view of, it's all relative, like what Kim just said about, you know, from complete opacity to some transparency. It really varies. You know, it's difficult to report on some of these incidents when I think of ransomware attacks, and I just wanted to make a point about the press's role in that, because you know, there's so many ransomware incidents happening, and there's an entire cottage industry dedicated to promoting them, including, you know, Twitter accounts and victim shaming sites and everything. So there's a lot. You got to be careful you're not carrying the water for the ransomware, you know, promoting them. I mean, not every ransomware breach is a story, and unfortunately, not everyone has that mentality when evaluating the story. They're not going to, you know, take any digs at anyone. But you know, there's sometimes you have to, at the very least, you have to contact the victim to get their comment. You know, it's at least, you know, we can't be going by the message boards on ransomware forums to pass that off as a breach. You know, so that's the other side of this, of reporting, is like that. I think a lot of companies get a little bit frazzled by some of the, I mean, the inadvertent or intentional way in which certain press coverage buffets the ransomware actor, you know. So that needs to change. But then the other, you know, has it changed much in terms of companies responding? I'm not really impressed with a lot of press statements in terms of, you know, of course you have to realize that the lawyers are getting involved. If it's a big company, especially, you know, you have people coming in on retainer to clean up the mess. You have lawyers saying don't say this or that. So it's not as if I'm unaware of those immense challenges, but generally speaking, you know, it's there needs to be much more transparency.
Thanks for that. And so this next audience question comes to us from JC Vega. And August, this one will certainly interest you. JC says, as you examine the future sci-fi and keep the public informed about important events through reporting, can you identify where your work has had an impact on some of the cyber great challenges? I know you have talked about diversity, education, informing the masses, etc. For instance, Ghost Fleet was required reading for many Army officers. This questioner would also just add that burn-in was awesome and countdown to 0 day was excellent. So we have a fan in the audience here. But basically the question is, do you see an impact on non-specialists or people who aren't steeped in this stuff every day?
Yeah, I can lead off with that. You know, with Ghost Fleet, for example, you know, we've had the instance where the way we described the hardware vulnerabilities in the supply chain that I'd mentioned earlier, you know, being taken more seriously in a different kind of conversation happening within Office or Secretary of Defense after people had read the book. You know, Pete has a great anecdote as well about a couple Navy admirals in a meeting I think they're in the tank in the Pentagon, and one of them is kind of sleepy, and the other's like, what's going on? And they said, hey, I just was up reading this, Go Sleep last night, and they talked about kind of what was keeping him up and why he had to read it, and that led to addressing a cyber vulnerability, in one of the Navy efforts. And then with burn-in more recently too, one of the things that Pete and I were able to do was write a fictional preface to the Cyber Solarium Commission report. And this is a short vignette, but really trying to anchor that document in the why this matters by showing what like the aftermath might look like from, say, a congressional staffer's perspective. Very much informed by the kind of reporting that went into burn-in the book, and taking that a step further and using that in a policy and a government document to do that. And so there's been some really great traction, for this kind of approach. And it's not just the work that I might be doing too, but when we get to work with other writers who are in government or private sector and see, their perspectives and voices come through fiction, that's really valuable, right? Because this is not, an approach that like I own. This is something that I'd love to see, proliferate, and thankfully that's starting to happen.
Kim, have you seen any concrete impacts or people really responding to some of your journalistic work?
Well, the election work, the election stories, some of the pieces that I've done, it prompted lawmakers to not pass legislation, unfortunately, but to try to pass legislation and to write letters and things like that. And I think that, definitely it has forced election officials to question, because I've been doing this for a long time, since 2003, covering the election stuff. And there was a time when election officials would not listen to anyone except the vendors that they were working with. And I think that, just hammering over and over again with the stories about what was the election officials were being told was incorrect, I think made them more skeptical. I've had election officials say to me in conferences and things like that, it helped them educate on the tech stuff that they never had a background on. But with the Countdown to Zero Day, it was sort of a different story, because that operation that it's describing is a classified operation. And so it was very tightly held among a very small group of people in government. And the rest of people in government weren't aware of it and didn't know the details. And after the book came out, I was surprised at the number of speaking invitations that I got from military bases to ask me to come out and speak to soldiers in all branches who are just at that point just getting into the cyber realm in terms of knowing about defense and what they needed to defend against. And there was also an NSA lawyer who had me come talk to his politics class, his geopolitics class. And the thing that he said to me always struck me was, he said that he was grateful for the book because it was a classified operation. It was not something he would ever be able to talk to his students about. This is the same thing about in the military. They weren't able to talk about this kind of thing. But having it in a book allows them to assign the book for reading. And then now that's classified operation that no one was allowed to know about, now it helps inform the people who should have been informed about it from the get-go, right? So I always thought that was interesting.
That is really fascinating, and it's a ridiculous rule that people with classified, clearances can't even engage with highly public, at this point, broken by journalists such as yourselves, news like that. I just find that so absurd. So one more quick question. I know we have to wrap up here. We had a question coming in from Alan Liska, and Sean, maybe you can tackle this. You hinted at it earlier, which is that many cyber criminals are getting better at quote unquote public relations. How do cybersecurity journalists responsibly interact with cyber criminals like ransomware authors?
A good question, Alan. That's, I think, like I said, you need to go. The story should not be based solely on cyber criminals, their word, but it's perfectly fine, again, and good, of course, if you want to interact and interview. And I think like Joseph Cox at Motherboard does one of the best jobs at this, is actually having sources in the criminal underground. That's part of reporting. It's just, you need to have more layers to it than just that. So, how do you not become their PR engine? I think, I don't know, I'm reluctant to even quote them, frankly. I don't know. It really depends on the situation. If you're talking about, I mean, you would have to have them show you some sort of technical proof of compromise before you know, as a way of confirming that they actually access systems. So a lot of it is just screenshots that anyone could replicate and boast about having ransomware at some company. And I don't think it's a story necessarily just because there's, you know, again, it has to be a news hook for it to be a ransomware story. A big company, it have to matter. It can't just be promoting, you know, the new ransomware gang in town and writing about how they hacked a you know, municipal computer or something like that. But
yeah, or it didn't actually hack a water pump at all. Well, I see Bryson just joined us, and so I just want to wrap up and thank you all so much for this really hopefully enlightening conversation for the audience members, and really keep up the good work, everyone. I know it's tough times in this pandemic, but you all have really produced some fantastic work and are just stellar media professionals. So thank you all for being here, and Bryson, I'll let you take it from here.
thanks, Blake.
All right.
Thanks,
Thank you, Blake,
yes.
and everybody.